In this video, we're going to cover the 9 steps to create a web page using PHP that connects directly to our MySQL database. So first step is to start by creating PHP code. Then we'll talk about how to connect to the MySQL database. We'll then discuss how to import other files that we've created using PHP, why we need to close the connection of our database. We will then create and execute a query. We will fetch rows. This would only be done with the select statement. We will then prepare an HTML table to display the results of our select statement. Although data does not necessarily need to be displayed in a table, this is an ideal format for users to be able to interpret it easily. Then step 7, we will display PHP in HTML. We will then create the HTML file and style that HTML file using CSS. So to begin, we will start by creating our PHP code. So in order to create a PHP page, we need to create a new file and we will add the code below. So the code here that you can see is less than sign question mark PHP. That's how we start our PHP code. And then whenever we're going to end our PHP code, we're going to do a question mark, then a greater than sign. So just to explain a little bit about PHP and what it does, PHP allows us as a backend language to interact and do some calculations. However, none of these calculations would be revealed to the user. This is all done behind the scenes. This is where all the logic should take place to ensure the security of our database and our web application. So if we wanted to actually send data that is interpreted by the backend server to the user, where the user can actually see that data, we need to use print or echo commands. So for example, here's an equation. If in my PHP code I declared a variable, this is declaring a variable, $x equals 5. So this would be the same as like an algebraic equation where I say x equals 5. The only thing that I need to do is add a $sign in front of the variable. Notice everything here in PHP closes with a semicolon. So if I were to declare a variable of 5, and then I wanted to show this to the user, I could say print x, which would be 5, and then HTML BR is a break line, which means we will add a new line. Then I could do another computation where I have y equals 2 and z equals 6. I could use echo to do some kind of calculation and display that. So x plus y, so we have 5 plus 2, so 7, times z, which is 6, so we'd have 42. So to show you what this looks like, we will go to my web server and build a PHP page. So when you log into my web server, you will see this home page. What you're going to do is click this hamburger icon in the top left. You will then go to the course, your personal directory, and then you may or may not have files from our previous assignments, but we're going to click this icon here and create a new file. This file I'm going to call supervisor.php. I'm going to go ahead and create it. I'm going to edit it. When you open up a PHP page, you will be able to see a code editor, and immediately below is the preview of your code. So this is the actual web page you would be creating. So since we don't have any code, there's going to be no web page. If you prefer to code side by side like me, you can toggle orientation like what I just did, and you could even shrink down the code so that you have more of a preview pane using this middle bar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste from our slide that code. As you can see here, it is printing out 5 because that's what I told it to, with a break line, which means go to a new line, and then print out the next thing using our echo command, which is 42. If I were to actually open up this web page, you would see 5 and 42. I'll go out full screen really quickly and you'll see that this is the URL of that particular web page. So the next thing we're going to discuss is how to actually connect to a MySQL database. So we will create a new file called db.php, and then we'll change the MySQL values as specified over here on the right. So over here in our PHP code, the first 4 lines we can see here are to define a variable. So we're going to define 4 variables. This is another way of doing defining of variables in PHP. We'll create a variable called MySQL host, another variable called MySQL user, another variable called MySQL password, and another variable called MySQL DB. The host in this case is going to be the host of my web server. And in this case, I ask that you use the IP address of my web server. So it would be 147.134.0.59. The next thing that you're going to use for your username is your net ID. And then for your password, you're going to use whatever you use to register for my web server. For your database, this will depend on what database you want to connect to. If you want to connect to the lecture schema, you would use lecture. If you want to connect to your personal schema, you would use your net ID. If you want to connect to your group schema, then you'd use your group schema here. These options are important and must be used. I don't really need to discuss it. If you're interested in understanding what those do, go ahead and look at the documentation. What we're going to do down here is we're now going to establish a new connection. So we'll create a new connection. This is going to say we're going to establish a MySQL connection. The host is going to be the host that we defined up here. See, MySQL host and MySQL host. The database name is going to be the database name that we defined up here. And then what we're going to use is the user and the password to connect to this database on this host. And then we'll pass in the options that we previously defined up here. We will then create this variable called connection. So this connection variable is actually my connection with the database. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create that file called db.php. We will open this file and we'll immediately see an error message on the right or below, however you have your orientation toggled. This error message is something that I've generated associated with the db.php file, basically saying whether or not you have successfully established a connection. So I'm going to go ahead and paste the code from my slide, and you'll see other error messages pop up. This is because I have not properly defined the host, username, password, and database. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to change the host to the IP address. The username would again be the net ID. And the password would be your password that you use to register for the server. We will then connect to the lecture schema for the purposes of what I'm going to teach you. I'm going to now type in my password, refresh the page, and show you what the error message would look like on the right. So I have successfully typed in my connection information, and as you can see here, we have successfully connected to the MySQL database using PHP. If you do not see this message, then you have unsuccessfully connected to the database. So check to make sure that you properly define your host, that you are using your net ID, you have not incorrectly typed the password, and that you're using the lecture schema. If you don't know what your password is, you're going to have to go over here and go to the settings page and reset your password, because there's no way that I can recover that for you. For step 3, we are going to now use a file to build a web page. This web page will then use the connection we just established to connect to our database. So as you can see here, we're going to import files and close the connection. So we'll create a new PHP file called supervisor.php. This is not the db.php page. And then we will add the code below. So we will require once the db.php. So what this is saying is, look in the same directory that I have supervisor.php created. If there is a file called db.php, include all the contents of it. So essentially, what that's doing is it's going to include all the contents of this db.php file, and we will have the connection that's associated with that. Now, the next thing that you see here is I'm going to close the connection by saying connection equals null. This just ensures that there is no open database connection. So again, the actual page, the code on the page is going to look like this. We open the connection and then we close the connection. But in order to do that, we're going to import all this, which means as if I had typed all of this code on this page right here. So the next step is to create and execute a query. So this is the same code from the previous slide. I'm just adding the new code that will be illustrated in bold. So in order to create the query, I'm going to first define a variable and set it equal to that query. So in this case, I'm going to say query equals, and then select star from the lecture schema, specifically the employee table from that, where the supervisor equals 3. Then I'm going to prepare the statement. Preparing the statement is vital to protect our database against SQL injections. We will talk about how this works in a later video segment. So I'm going to prepare this query. I'm going to then set it equal to a statement variable. To then actually execute the query against the database, I'm going to say statement dash greater than execute, open and close parentheses. This is essentially as if I had actually clicked the submit button to execute the query. If you wanted to see the results of your query, you could actually print them. It comes in an array format, so in order to print an array, you would have to say print_r, and then we could say from this statement that we just executed, fetch all the rows of that. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this into our supervisor.php page and show you what this looks like. So I'm going to now go out of my db.php page and step back into the supervisor.php page. I'm going to just overwrite all the contents in this page. As you can see, nothing here is displayed in the browser. Why? Because I have not actually done anything to say, hey, show this to the user. So that's why on the right side it's completely empty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to print an array of all the results from my database. So as you can see here, the statement is going to fetch all that. So again, like I said, it's an array. So we have an employee ID with number 1, first name with Phil, last name with Morris, street with that, and so on. And if we go far enough, we will now see another array, and this one's going to be employee 2, first name Lawrence, and so on. This is printing out all the records from the database. So this has indeed touched my database, pulled all these records, and now is displaying it on a web page. Now, as you can see here, this is not an ideal format for displaying this data, which we will talk about how to address this at a later time. So in order to properly display this data, we want to fetch each individual row separately. So in order to do that, we're going to use statement fetch. Statement fetch is going to grab a single row and just store it in a row variable here. Now, in a query, we can have more than one row. So what we need to do is move to the next step, and that is going to loop through each one of these rows. So this for each is going to look inside of the results of this statement, and it's going to grab a single row. It is going to then do all the logic between this open curly bracket and this closing curly bracket, and then grab the next row. And it will keep looping through until there are no more rows to grab. As you can see, there is nothing between the curly brackets, so nothing is going to be done at this point. So how do we get this data to actually be displayed? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to prepare an HTML table. So the first thing we're going to do is create a variable called content. This content variable has nothing in it. I'm just basically storing a blank string for right now. A blank string means a text with nothing at all. What I'm going to eventually do is display this content to the browser. That's why I'm creating this variable. We are going to store inside of this content variable eventually a table. So we're going to open the table and we're going to close the table. So that is basically going to create the outside perimeter of a table in our HTML web page. Inside this table, we're going to have rows. This is represented using tr. So we're going to open the tr tag and close the tr tag. So this tr tag is going to create one row. Inside of this row, we're going to have 3 THs. This stands for table header. So we have an employee ID, first name, and last name. So employee ID would go here, first name would go here, and last name would go here. We are then going to create content rows. This is going to create a row for every single record from this particular query. Inside of each one of these rows, we're going to have table cells, so table data, so TD, TD, TD. So we're going to have table data with employee ID, table data with the first name, and the table data with the last name. So essentially, we're going to have 4 rows of data represented here. Now, how do we display this data? So we are looping through this statement. We're going to grab a row. Inside of this row, we're going to specifically look for that employee ID, first name, and last name. If there is an employee ID, first name or last name, it will be displayed between these table data tags. Notice how I have this code in curly brackets. This is to ensure that this is interpreted as code that comes from PHP rather than causing errors because it can't recognize that. So essentially, as you can see here from our previous example, we have an array, and inside this first row, we have an employee ID of 1. So when I come back here and say row of employee ID, it's going to grab 1. And the first name is Phil and the last name is Morris. So it's going to grab the first name Phil and display it here, and grab the last name Morris and display it here. Then I'm going to add the content that I've added to in this loop to the actual table itself. Now you'll notice here that in this content I have a dot equals. This dot equals is critical. What the dot is saying is take the existing content and add this content to it. So it's going to loop through, add one row, then add the next row, then add the next row. If I didn't have this dot, what it would do is it would loop through, it would set the content equal to the first row, then grab the next row and overwrite the previous content. I don't want to overwrite it, I want to add to it. I want to have 4 rows instead of 1 row, and that's why I'm using the dot equals. I am then adding this content to the table content, and I'm setting it, the content variable, equal to everything inside of that table. All right, what I'm going to do is just copy from my slide and paste over everything that we've already done. I will go ahead and delete this first line of code. All right, so as you can see here, we still don't have anything displayed. Well, the reason why is we haven't explicitly told PHP to send the content to the browser. So I can do that by saying print content. And as you can see here, now we have a table with the data that we returned from our database. This looks a lot better than what we had. However, as you can see here, the table is not that ideal. So let's go ahead and talk about HTML and CSS. Okay, so all this code is identical from the previous slide. I've just condensed it down so that I can show you a little bit more information. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create our HTML page. Inside this HTML page, we're going to specifically say that we're going to use a doc type of HTML, indicating this is an HTML document. HTML pages should start with the HTML tag and close with it. Anything that we want the user to see should be in the body tag and close the body tag. And then we're going to introduce a div, which is basically a division in the particular web page. This div will have a class of container, which we will talk about in just a minute. H3 is basically header 3, so if you think about a Word document, header 3 is going to be bigger than header 4, header 1 is going to be the biggest. So header 3 in this case is I'm going to have employee supervised by employee ID number 3 are going to be bigger than most of the rest of the text. And then here I'm going to have another division in the page. This is going to start the PHP code again, and this time I'm going to echo the content, similar to what I just showed you on the actual web application. Instead of echoing the content here, it's going to go in the specific location in this particular web page. So what I'm going to do now is create the CSS file. This CSS file is going to allow me to restructure or make this look a lot nicer than what it has done before. So in order to do this, first thing I'm going to do is create a main.css file. Note that the code for this CSS file is all in the notes pane, so I strongly encourage you to grab from the notes pane all that code and use that for your main.css file. To give you a brief overview of what this does, I'm going to introduce a few things. So div in the CSS file is going to look for any div. So as you can see, we have one div and we have another div. The dot container says div with a class of container. So this is a div with a class of container. So wherever we find that, we are going to make it 50% the width of the entire page. Then we're going to have a margin. And if we just have two values, the first one is going to be the top and bottom, and the second one is going to be left and right. So essentially what this is doing is say have a container with a width of 50% with 80 pixels above the container and 80 pixels below the container, and then we're going to center that on the page. Then H3, what we're doing here, color is going to define this particular blue color, as you can see here. We are going to make the padding 10 pixels. That basically means that the text here is going to have about 10 pixels of padding around the top and bottom, because that's the first value, and then no pixels on the left and right. And then the font size is going to be 1.6 EM, which means that approximately that's going to be 60% bigger than what the actual content of the page would have. So that's why you can see that this just got a little bit bigger. So here's the original. I extend this, and you can see that it got a lot bigger. Then on the table, we're going to format it differently so that it looks nice like this. So the table is going to be 100% the width of whatever element it's in. So inside of this content, we have that table. So this div is inside of this container, so it's going to fill the entire container. We are going to align it with the left of this div. Then the table headers, and the table cells are going to all have a border of 1 pixel. That is this border that goes around. Collapse means that we are going to merge row and cell into one line instead of having multiple lines shown. This border is CCC, so that's this light gray, and it's solid instead of dashed or dotted, etc. TH and TD mean that we're going to have 3 pixels on the top and bottom and 5 pixels on the left and right, and that's what allows the text to not touch or butt up against the lines in my table. Then I have a table row of the nth child even, which means that every even row is now going to have a background color of EEE, and every odd row is going to have a background color of FA, FA, FA. So this EE is this gray, and the FA is a closer to white color. So I'm going to go back to my web page. The first thing that I'm going to do is change this web page to then include the HTML that we previously discussed. And then I'm going to go back to my directory. I'm going to create a new file called main.css. And inside this file, I'm going to copy all the contents from the notes pane of the CSS slide. So as you can see here, there's a lot more CSS than what we discussed on that slide. If you're interested in playing around with this, go ahead. You can change anything here and see how it changes the content of the page. Notice over here that I have a preview for your CSS file. We're going to just select the supervisor.php and see what happens if we style it with the CSS. As you can see, it looks a lot nicer, the table is a lot easier to read, and we have a little bit of a background color going on. This doesn't actually apply the CSS to this page, it just gives a preview to this page. So now let's go ahead and actually style our page with this CSS. So what's critical here is we're going to now introduce a new tag called head. The head tag gives me the ability to customize some behind the scenes information. So in this case, I'm going to create a link that is going to reference the main.css file. Just like with our require once, this needs to be in the same folder as my supervisor.php, otherwise I need to change this to reference it. And this is going to be a type of style sheet. So by adding just this to my supervisor.php page, it should reformat the page to display the new CSS. So let's go ahead and do that now. So we're going to go back to our directory. We'll open up supervisor.php, and then above the body tag, I'm just going to paste the head tag. And now we have a fully functional page that has connected to our database using PHP.